Well, welcome to Sophie & Co. I'm Sophie Shevard-Natze. The rise of the political right is being felt across Europe, and the Netherlands is no exception, where controversial politician Geert Wilders, a veteran of the game, took second place with his party. Well, the radical policies of his now make it into the Dutch and European mainstream. Well, I ask the man himself. Geert Wilders is my guest today.
As the immigration crisis fuels the rise of the right wing in Europe, the anti-Muslim sentiment is stirring in the continent, and the EU finds itself between the rock and a hard place on the world stage. Will the European Union be able to adapt to the issues of the day? How should Brussels navigate the complex foreign policy conundrums? And will the new political movements from the right force it to change beyond recognition?
Geert Wilders, welcome to the show. Great to have you back with us on our program. So, in the Dutch election in March, you were tipped to win, but that didn't quite happen. Was it a clear sign to you that the Dutch people don't really like the changes you are proposing?
No, exactly the opposite. We were actually one of the winners. We gained more than 30% of our votes. We had 15 seats in the Dutch parliament before the elections, and we came out with 20 seats after the elections. And actually, the winner of the elections, the party of the current Prime Minister Rutte, lost a lot of seats. So indeed, we became the runner-up, the second biggest party, but we were one of the biggest winners of the elections at the end of the day.
You criticized the elites, the establishment, but I mean, you've been part of Dutch politics for 20 years. Aren't you the elite and the establishment?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, it's not how long you are in politics, it's what you propose to do. And I think that at the end of the day, the Dutch people should, the Dutch politicians, the Dutch government should listen to the Dutch people. And we don't. In Holland, it's not America first or Russia first, but it's Holland last. And whether it comes to the European Union, where we are the biggest net contributor that we are paying to southern European countries, all our taxpayers' money, or whether it comes to the mass immigration. The Dutch people and the Dutch electorate get a very bad deal from the current elite. And what I propose is that we listen more to the people. And the people want a sovereign and a strong Netherlands that is working together with other countries when they see fit and have a common interest, but not be as stupid as the policy is, unfortunately, still today.
So after the election in France and Netherlands, right-leaning parties like yours had a strong showing. French President Macron and German Chancellor Merkel even started talking about serious reform in the EU. Will you be content with the reform they're proposing?
Now, you know, if European politicians or people who are in favor of more European Union talk about reforms, what they actually mean is not reform, but more European Union. And indeed, parties like mine, we won the elections. My party, as I told you, became the second biggest party in the Netherlands, where we have 13, 14 parties in parliament. In France, Marine Le Pen, as you rightfully mentioned, became the second party in France. In Austria, the FPÖ became the second biggest party in Austria, and probably going to govern as well in Austria. In Germany, you saw that the Alternative für Deutschland, a new party, became the third biggest party of Germany. So indeed, our voice, the voice of millions of Europeans, is getting stronger today. And we don't want more European reform. We want more national sovereignty. We want less European Union. And my party wants to leave the European Union. We believe that we can only be sovereign and in charge of our own front door when it comes to immigration if we are outside the European Union and become a strong sovereign nation again.
So, Mr. Wilders, your party is called the Party for Freedom, and you talk about freedom all the time. But at the same time, I mean, you're suggesting closing mosques all over the Netherlands and making Islam unattractive. How does this go along with freedom that you're promoting?
Well, that's a very good question. Actually, I believe that Islam and freedom are incompatible. Look to all the countries in the world where Islam is dominant today. You see a total lack of freedom, a lack of civil society, a lack of rule of law, and a lack of both individual and collective rights. So I believe that the more we fight the Islamization of our free societies, the more we preserve our freedom. And so I'm fighting for freedom, and I called my party the Party for Freedom because I want our families, our children, our grandchildren, also in 50 years, to be free citizens. And if we would become one day more Islamic, it would go on the worst when it comes to freedom.
So what about the freedom of practicing your religion? I mean, you talk about your children and your grandchildren. You never know. One of them may marry a Muslim, turn into a Muslim. You may have Muslim great-grandchildren. What about their freedom of practicing their religion? It's a choice, right?
Well, you know, yes, but I believe, and this is why I believe it's not incompatible with our constitution, which, as you rightfully hinted at, has a freedom of religion. I believe that Islam is not so much a religion, but more an ideology that wants to, a totalitarian ideology that wants to dominate not only a whole person's life, but also a whole society. And one of the examples I always give, and I explain people why it's more an ideology than a religion, is that if you were willing to leave Islam, the penalty is death. You are not free, as in, for instance, Christianity or Judaism or Buddhism, to leave. And this is a token of an ideology, of an even totalitarian ideology. So I believe that we should have no freedom we have a freedom of religion, even in the Dutch constitution, but if we see Islam not so much as a religion, but as a totalitarian ideology that, once again, does not want to assimilate in a society, but wants to dominate, it goes against the freedom of women, of the press, of homosexuals, of Christians, of Jews. And this is something, once again, if you want a society that is free, you have to have less Islam.
All right, I'm no advocate of Islam, I'm Christian myself, but I think what you're talking about is a very narrow following in Islam, and that would be called maybe Wahhabis or extreme Muslims, but I don't believe that applies to majority of the Muslim people that I know and that live around the world. But that is your opinion, okay. And the same thing could be said about the Christian religion. I mean, if you go really deep into the Bible, it goes against gays and it goes against women's rights, and all of that could be said about Christian religion as well. It's really about how you read religion. But anyways, okay, so you've been saying that there is no such thing as moderate Islam, but at the same time, I know that in conference in Italy in September, you said that many individual Muslims are moderates. So who are these moderate Muslims? If there is no moderate Islam, who are those moderate Muslims? Can you give me examples?
Now, listen, I make a distinction, as I always have done, between the ideology and the people. And indeed, there is no moderate Islam. There is no European Islam or that kind of nonsense. There's only one Islam, and that is the Islam of the book, the Quran, of the life of Muhammad, and that is the Islam that we know and that unfortunately cannot and will never be changed. It's not extreme. Extreme Islam is a pleonasm. It means exactly the same. On the other hand, you have the people. And I do believe in moderate people. And indeed, I do acknowledge that there are many Muslims around the world who are moderate people. But unfortunately, and this is one of the differences when you compare it, as you just did, with Christians or Jews today, we see that societies where Muslims are in a large amount, or maybe even the majority, that there is a total lack of freedom and democracy. Whether you're talking about the more liberal kind of Arab countries like, for instance, Egypt or others, or the more tougher like Iran or the Wahhabi, indeed, the Sunni Muslim country. And in my own country, the Netherlands, today, we saw at researches that we have in Holland almost 1 million Muslims, and a kind of leftish liberal institution as the University of Amsterdam made a survey, and it proved that 11% of the Dutch Muslims, which is more than 100,000 people, which is twice the amount of the Dutch army, they stated in Holland that they are willing to use violence in Holland for their beliefs, for Islam. And we don't see that with any other religion. And this is what we are importing in the West today. We don't see all terroristic acts all over Europe today, almost on a monthly or sometimes weekly basis, committed by people in the name of Christianity, of Judaism. And indeed, not every Muslim is a terrorist, but unfortunately most of the terrorists in Europe today are Muslims. And we can be politically correct and ignore it, but I think it's a lot wiser to accomplish that.
Mr. Willis, of course, I mean, the Islamist terror threat to Europe is very real. No one argues with that. But don't you think that measures like closing mosques or tough cracking down on Muslims, that would work actually the other way around, increase the risk of terror attacks rather than reduce it?
No, exactly the opposite. So we have to stand up. And we don't have to call any Muslim a terrorist. That would be ridiculous. I would even reject such a suggestion. But we should not import more Islam. On the contrary, we should de-Islamize our society. And the Quran, once again, is a book that has more anti-Semitism in it than, for instance, Mein Kampf from Adolf Hitler. And we should see it for what it is. Not all the people are bad people. On the contrary. But the ideology is a dangerous ideology. And I traveled when I was still a free man, when I was not protected by the secret police or by the diplomatic police for 24/7, when I had no fatwas from Al-Qaeda and other organizations on my head. I traveled throughout the Middle East and I went to almost every Islamic country and I met so many friendly and hospitable people. But I saw that the influence on Islam on almost every Arab and Islamic country was devastating. People were not free. There was terror even within the Islamic world, let alone in the countries that are importing Islam. So we should do one thing, define who we are, which is non-Islamic. We are a country, we are a continent based on Christianity, on Judaism, on humanism, and Islam at the end of the day should not become more dominant here.
All right, we're going to take a short break right now. When we're back, we'll continue discussing Europe's pressing issues with Geert Wilders, leader of the Dutch Party for Freedom. Stay tuned. With Geert Wilders, leader of the Dutch Party for Freedom, discussing major trends in today's European politics. Mr. Wilders, like you said, your opinions on Islam have landed you on the Al-Qaeda hit list. I know you're surrounded by security 24/7. You live in a safe house. I mean, does all of this isolation get to your head? A politician has to be close to his nation, to his people. I can imagine that being detached from everyday reality isn't that good for it.
Hey, listen, last elections, my party, out of 13 parties in parliament, won 1/3 of our votes, and we became the second biggest party in Holland. We only exist for 10 years. It never happened in Holland before that a relatively new party became the second biggest party in parliament. So we are not unattached. We are maybe attached even more than any other party. Look at the outcome of the democratic elections. We are attached. And indeed, it's not easy. I fight for the freedom of my people. I fight for the freedom of the West as I see it. And in the process, I lost my personal freedom. And let me tell you, if I would have been addressing and criticizing Christianity or Judaism, which I'm not, to be clear, but if I would have done that, I would not have been on a hit list. I would not have lost my personal freedom. People would not have tried to murder me. So this is exactly my point. I'm not the only one in the world. If you look at other people or other organizations or journalists or politicians who criticize Islam, they get into the same trouble. And it proves exactly my point that moderation is far to reach for in Islam.
Mr. Wilders, the refugee problem spiralling out of control has got Europe questioning one of its greatest achievements, open borders. Do you feel the Schengen zone has to go and free movement of people across Europe with it?
Yeah, that's the only way to get rid of the Schengen zone. The only way is that we have to stop the immigration from Middle East or Africa. And if you think that what happened with the immigration crisis that we saw in the last few years with all these so-called asylum seekers that came to our part of the world, that was bad, I would say you haven't seen anything yet. You know, if you look at the figures from the United Nations, you will see that there will be a quadrupling of the inhabitants of Africa. Today, Africa has 1 billion inhabitants, and in the end of this century, that will grow from 1 billion to 4 billion. And surveys prove that 1/3 of those people would want to immigrate, and most probably to the richer part, the north of Africa, to Europe. So if we don't wake up, if we don't stop Schengen, if we don't become masters again of our own house, if we don't again be in charge of our front door, we will cease to exist. I'm not exaggerating that if you look at the numbers, that at the end of the day we are facing today an existential problem, worse than any economical problem we have ever faced. An existential problem, whether we will exist or not at the end of this century if we don't start by defining our borders and controlling and deciding ourselves who we let into our house and who should leave our house as any normal citizens. Also the people looking at your program today, they are deciding in their own homes, in all of Russia or anywhere else in the world, who to let in their house and when people or guests should leave the house. We are not doing that in most of the European countries today. We only know the policy of open borders, and at the end of the day, it will not be our house anymore.
Wouldn't closing the Schengen zone actually destroy the European Union?
Well, for me, that would not be a bad thing, because I'm very much against the European Union. I'm a lot in favor of Europe. I believe that we should work together with other countries in the continent of Europe where we have a common interest, for instance, in the internal market, or to fight terrorism, or to have economical ties. I would really want to cooperate, but we don't need an institution like the European Union, where mostly unelected people, like all the European commissioners, are deciding for our democracies what to do. And if you talk about immigration, today, European Union, Brussels, is in charge of our immigration rules, and the national capitals, the national governments, not anymore. They have transferred most of the immigration policies to Brussels. So we are not in charge of our own front door anymore. So it would be a good thing instead of a bad thing if it would erode, not Europe, but the institution called the European Union.
You've said that hysterical Russophobia reigns in Europe and in the Netherlands. Why is that? I mean, does Europe have enough problems without this being drummed up too?
Well, you know, I see a terrible thing happening in most of the European countries. On the one hand, they criticize the American administration. They make fun of Mr. Trump, and I'm not defending Mr. Trump on all the things he does, but there is only criticism. 99% of the politicians criticized one of the superpowers in the world, the United States of America. And on the other hand, the same politicians criticize another superpower in the world called the Russian Federation. And I think that is very unwise. That is very unwise from a geopolitical point of view. That is very unwise from an economical point of view, because I believe we need both. We need to have a friendship with the Russian Federation, and we need to have a transatlantic friendship as Europe, as European countries, with the United States of America. And indeed, today, you see that it's almost a trend in Europe to criticize the Russian Federation, to make them responsible for almost everything that goes wrong. And I think that's very bad. Not only we cannot afford it, but often it's also not substantialized. And of course, I also have criticism towards both Russia and the United States. But we have, and it's in our own interest and we have a lot in common as well with Russia to become more allies than enemies.
Now, you said that you want to create an alternative to this Russophobia. What is it going to be like? I mean, how do you make this alternative appealing to the political elites?
Well, you know, first, also among allies, you have to be able to criticize each other as friends when it's needed. And of course, when it comes, for instance, at the cooperation with the whole process of this terrible terroristic attack towards my Dutch fellow countrymen, when it comes to the shutting down of the plane MH17 or other things, there is a lot of criticism or asking for cooperation also towards Russia. But we also have so much in common with Russia on other aspects. We have the same kind of culture. We are Christians. A big part of Russian is Russian Orthodox Christian. We have the same problems often when it comes to the future of immigration. We both have had bad experience when it comes to terrorism, also in Russia, whether it's in Moscow or what happened in Chechnya in the past, we had in a similar way the same kind of experience. So what I believe is that we should not only criticize, but we should cooperate. And I'm very happy to have been invited by the Russian ambassador and the Russian parliament, the Duma, to visit Russia in the beginning of next year, to meet people from your government, from the Russian government, from the Russian parliament, and also perhaps to have critical remarks against one another, but also to get a better understanding. Russia is not our enemy. I believe that Russia is an ally, and we should invest in better relations.
So the media has been calling you the Dutch Donald Trump. I don't know if you like that comparison or not. What do you make of it? Do you feel you have many things in common with the American president?
I have, on some aspects, I have respect for Mr. Trump. On other aspects, I don't have respect for what he does. I still believe that if I would have been an American, which I'm not, I would also have voted for Mr. Trump and not for Mrs. Clinton. But hey, I'm not an American. I'm a Dutchman, and I'm responsible for the policy of my country, now today in opposition. And so I'm not to be compared. But what I believe and what the strength is of both Mr. Trump, but also Mr. Putin, is that they all believe that the interest of their own country goes first. Mr. Putin goes for Russia first, for the first interest of the Russian people, and Mr. Trump in his own way does it for the United States of America. And I wish in Europe, in my own country, the Netherlands, we had a leader, we had a prime minister who, like Mr. Trump or Mr. Putin, would say Holland first, or Europe, not the European Union, but Europe first. And we don't have that.
I want to talk a bit about EU's relation to the United States. Chancellor Merkel thinks that EU has to rely on itself from now on, as the partnership between the United States and Europe is cracking under President Trump. Do you see a reliable partner in the current US administration?
No, I don't think that's that bad. And I even believe that European politicians use it. They misuse it. They misuse and they call for a so-called worse relationship with the United States of America. They complain about a bad relation with the Russian Federation only to be able to say to their people that we have to get more European Union. But please don't be fooled by the politicians as Mrs. Merkel or Mr. Macron, the president of France, who says we need to get a stronger Europe. Today we get even a European army. I don't want a European army. We don't need a European army. It's all the politicians who make people afraid that we have bad relations with Russia, bad relations with the United States, only to enforce more supranationalism in Brussels and the European Union. That is the real reason, and that is something I don't subscribe to.
So, Mr. Woodless, EU during the Obama years followed American policies closely. But now that there's difference of opinions with Trump, do you think the US will lose its influence over Europe?
Now, I think that America is an important ally to Europe. And I think that the American people are our friends, as the Russian people should be. But of course, there are different administrations. And I think that even though one might criticize or applaud some of the measures the American administration makes, that at the end of the day we cannot afford to have either bad relations with both America and with Russia. And I think that it would be very irresponsible, as many politicians do, to criticize only the American and the Russian administration. America is an important ally. Mr. Trump is the president of an important country, as Mr. Putin is the president of an important country, and we should have good relations with both of them.
Mr. Wilders, thank you for being with us today. We were talking to Geert Wilders, leader of the Dutch Party for Freedom, discussing the pressing challenges Europe is facing today. That's it for this edition of Sophie & Co. I will see you next time.
Thank you so much.